It's kind of funny when you think about it. You'd expect, right, with all that Reformation emphasis on, like, personal faith, that the immediate next thing would be sending out tons of missionaries to start churches all over the place.
Yeah.
But actually, it's pretty surprising to discover that in those early days of Protestant missions, church planting wasn't always the main thing they were after. It makes you wonder about some of the stuff we just kind of assume about mission history.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a fascinating place to start, for sure. And that initial, I guess, focus or maybe even more like differing priorities, that really sets the stage for what we're going to dive into today. We're going to be looking at the different like core tasks that Christians throughout history have understood as like the central things they should be doing in the world for their mission, right? We've got this whole range of sources spanning like centuries, and they reveal how these understandings have developed and sometimes even like completely diverged over time.
Totally. And for someone like you who's all about getting a really clear, in-depth understanding of complex topics, but also doing it quickly, like efficiently,
Yeah.
Spot expressing these historical debates is super valuable because this isn't just like some abstract theological discussion happening in a vacuum. It's directly shaped and still shapes how the church sees its role in the world and like what it actually does.
Right.
So our missions for this deep dive is to really unpack these different ways people have understood what exactly the church is supposed to do.
Exactly. And to give you a roadmap, we'll be looking at several key emphases, right? So first, we'll check out the idea of proclamation and personal conversion as like the fundamental task. Then we'll shift to the emphasis on church planting and growth. After that, we'll dig into the historically significant focus on civilization and moral improvement. And finally, we'll explore philanthropy, humanization, and liberation as like driving motivations behind mission. And as our sources show, these categories, they're not always totally separate, There's been overlap for sure, but their importance relative to each other, that's definitely shifted over time.
Okay, so let's jump into that first one. Proclamation and conversion. This feels like it was the initial spark, the driving force behind a lot of those early Protestant missions, right?
Totally. Absolutely. The earliest Protestant missions, especially those coming from Puritan and pious traditions, they were really deeply rooted in this conviction about humanity's utterly lost state without God's grace.
Right.
Think about those key figures like John Eliot working with the Native American tribes and the Pietist missionaries, Bartholomew Ziegenbalg and Heinrich Pietschau. These are foundational figures. And it's really interesting that the very first missionary society in England was established way back in 1649, specifically to support Eliot's work.
Wow. And the core belief fueling all that was this intense conviction about how absolutely necessary it was for people to have a personal experience of conversion.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. Sidney Rue, in his analysis of Puritan mission theology, he highlights this. He states that the soteriological consideration that men must be brought to personal conversion dominates the Puritan message. So for them, the dire spiritual condition of humanity, apart from divine intervention, that made personal conversion the overarching goal. They definitely did humanitarian efforts too, stuff like aid, education, and all that. But these were always seen as secondary to the ultimate goal, which was individual salvation.
So the takeaway here is this really early Protestant focus on individual salvation as the main driver of mission, often putting immediate conversion ahead of longer-term things like church building.
Yeah.
But, we'll see, this approach, it also got some criticism for potentially leading to a superficial kind of faith and neglecting the bigger picture of discipleship and community.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it was basically all about saving individual souls first and foremost.
That's the heart of it, yeah. Then in the mid-18th century, you see the Moravian Brethren rising up. They were really influenced by pietism.
Yeah.
And just for those who might not be familiar, that was a movement that put a huge emphasis on personal religious experience and intense devotion.
Right.
And it really influenced early mission thinking in a big way.
Yeah.
And they, the Moravians, profoundly impacted John Wesley and the Methodist movement too. Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, he was a central figure for the Moravians, and he talked about missions as primarily gathering souls for the coming kingdom. And what's super interesting here is that he was kind of hesitant about setting up like formal church structures right away.
Interesting.
He even viewed the organized church with a bit of skepticism. For him, the real focus was on individual conversion and that direct relationship with Christ.
So that's actually a pretty different view of the church's role than a lot of people have today. So for Zinzendorf and those early Moravians, it wasn't about building these big institutions right off the bat.
No, not at all. His main thing was gathering what he called the first fruits of nations, like small groups of converted people into what he called ecclesiolae in ecclesia, little churches within the larger society. His idea was that a wider ingathering and then the need for more formal structures that would all come naturally later. So both the Pietists and the Moravians, they were fundamentally focused on this convertio gentilium, the conversion of the Gentiles, but without necessarily having like a super clear long-term strategy for how these new believers would fit into established church life. The emphasis was so heavily on that initial personal conversion experience.
Gotcha. And then you have the revivalist movement sweeping through, like the Great Awakenings and all that. How did they fit into this understanding of mission as primarily proclamation?
Oh, revivalism, it definitely cranked up the volume on personal conversion.
Yeah.
Figures like John Wesley, George Whitefield, and later on in the 19th and 20th centuries, you have Dwight L. Moody and Billy Graham. They really popularized this idea of mission as basically proclamation leading to a personal decision for faith, which was often, marked by some kind of public statement or display. And what's really fascinating is how this super intense focus on individual conversion, it intersected with this growing desire for like Christian unity across different denominations.
Oh, interesting. How so? Because it seems like different denominations could have pretty different ideas of what conversion even is?
Exactly. And that's precisely why these interdenominational missionary societies like the London Missionary Society, the LMS,
Yeah.
they intentionally downplayed the importance of church planting. They recognize that, if you start talking about church structure, governance, all that, it could get super divisive between different Protestant groups.
Right, right.
But the fundamental need for simple evangelism, just proclaiming the core message about Christ, that was something they could all agree on.
Yeah.
David Bogue, one of the main founders of the LMS, he famously said their goal was to bring about the funeral of bigotry. So their central idea was to send out the gospel message itself, not to try and copy a specific denominational structure in new places.
So this really urgent need to get the gospel message out to as many people as possible that basically took priority over immediately setting up those long-term church structures.
Absolutely. And the sense of urgency was fueled by a very real belief in the eternal consequences,
Right.
specifically eternal damnation for those who died without hearing and accepting Christ. Just the thought of huge numbers of people perishing without this knowledge, it created this immense drive for evangelism.
Yeah.
Hudson Taylor's image, the one he's so famous for, of a Niagara Falls of thousands of souls perishing daily, that really captures how strongly they felt about it.
Wow, yeah.
You see a similar urgency in the student volunteer movement with their goal of, get this, is the world in this generation. And while some leaders within these movements, guys like Arthur T. Pearson and John R. Mott, they did caution against like a superficial approach to evangelism, the main feeling was still this extreme urgency to spread the message as widely and as quickly as humanly possible. By the 19th century, this idea of evangelism as like the central, most critical task of missions, it was pretty widespread across most Protestant missionary agencies.
I feel like they saw themselves as first responders or something, rushing to save as many people as possible from like a huge fire.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. It really gets at the spirit and the motivation behind it all. Even Gustav Warneck, who we think of as the father of modern missiology, and who was a big advocate for church planting and that broader Christianization of cultures, even he firmly believed that proclamation and personal conversion, those were the foundational starting point for any mission work. He said that, and this is a famous quote, "The salvation of souls is and remains everywhere the essential core work of Christ's messenger." So he believed that individual conversions, those had to be the bedrock for everything else, even if they were just the first step.
So proclamation is crucial, no doubt. But our sources also point out some potential problems if it becomes the only thing missions focus on.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Overemphasizing rapid, widespread proclamation and neglecting other vital aspects can lead to people having a superficial understanding of what the gospel actually is. And then you end up with these like shallow conversions that don't have a strong base.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
The urgency to reach everyone on Earth as quickly as possible, it makes sense on one level, but it can sometimes mean that speed and breadth get prioritized over depth and real understanding. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
You get these well-meaning slogans like, no one should hear the gospel twice until everyone has heard it once.
right.
And while that sounds good, wanting everyone to hear it, it can also accidentally devalue the need for proper teaching, discipleship, and the ongoing nurture of faith. Even Arthur T. Pearson, who was a big proponent of reaching the unreached, he saw the danger in neglecting solid biblical teaching. And to add another layer of complexity, communicating the gospel across different cultures, that's a really intricate process.
Right.
You have to think about worldviews, people's different needs and experiences, and the potential for huge misunderstandings. Like, even the Apostle Paul and Barnabas ran into this in their ministry, as we see in Acts chapter 14.
Yeah, so it's a balancing act, right?
It is. While those rapid evangelization strategies can sometimes get impressive numbers in the short term, the long-term effects on individuals and communities, those can be debatable. The problems of nominalism, where people say they believe but aren't really committed, syncretism, where Christian beliefs get mixed up with other religious practices, and a general lack of understanding of basic biblical teachings, those are all pretty sobering reminders that there needs to be balance.
So it's kind of a case of more isn't always better, right? Like prioritizing quantity over quality can sometimes hurt the long-term impact.
That's a really good way to put it, yeah. And another point is that an exclusive focus on proclamation, it kind of cuts short the full picture of the Great Commission as it's presented in the Gospels.
Right.
Mark and Luke definitely emphasize proclaiming the good news, yeah, but Matthew's account, it clearly includes the command to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you.
Right.
And John's gospel talks about Jesus sending his followers out into the world just as the Father has sent me. And that implies a way bigger task than just preaching, right?
Yeah.
And Paul himself, he invested so much time and energy in the ongoing spiritual development of believers and the health and growth of the churches he planted. Proclamation, while it's totally essential as the first step, it doesn't cover the whole mission.
So it's not just about bringing people to an initial point of belief. It's about guiding them on that longer journey of faith and obedience.
Yeah, that's it. And another thing is putting too much emphasis on a single decision for Christ without understanding that he's Lord of all of life, that can lead to people misunderstanding what true biblical conversion actually means.
Interesting.
The apostles definitely called for an immediate response of repentance and faith, but this was always understood as a call to a whole new life of being in relationship with God and submitting to his authority. True conversion, the way the New Testament describes it, is a total change in allegiance. It's recognizing and accepting Jesus as the Lord of your entire life, not just accepting a get-out-of-jail-free card for eternity while living the same way you did before. This transformative encounter, it affects every part of a person and their connection with the community of believers.
And this individualistic focus on personal conversion, it sounds like it can sometimes miss how important Christian community really is.
You got it. Wilbert Schenck, a missiologist, he's pointed out that, surprisingly, ecclesiology, that's the study of the church, it played a pretty small role in a lot of 19th century Protestant mission theology. Even Warnock, though he was all about church planting, he warned against thinking of salvation and mission in a way that's too individualistic. The New Testament, it doesn't present faith as a solo act. You know, Jesus talked about the potential cost of following him, even to the point of leaving family, but he also promised a new eternal family in the community of his followers. And throughout Acts and the epistles, you constantly see not just individuals coming to faith, but whole households converting, which led to the formation of local churches where faith could grow and be lived out in community. That's the consistent pattern. Churches don't just magically appear fully formed after someone preaches the gospel. They take intentional work, discipleship, and the building of real community.
So just to sum up what we've been talking about, proclamation and conversion are super necessary. They're like the foundation of Christian mission.
Right.
But they can't be the only focus.
Definitely. Our source puts it well when it concludes that proclamation alone just isn't enough to fulfill the whole Great Commission, but it's still that vital first step, rooted in Jesus' direct commands, the example of the apostles, and the basic logic of the gospel itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anything calling itself Christian mission that doesn't actually share the good news of salvation through Jesus, it's missing the core, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, that gives us a good grasp of proclamation and conversion. Let's move to the next big one, church planting and growth. It sounds like this has had a slightly different, maybe even more winding path in mission history.
Yeah, it has. It's interesting. The Roman Catholic Church has historically put a huge emphasis on plantatio ecclesiae, the planting of churches.
Right.
They base this on that early church father Cyprian's idea of extra ecclesiam milla salus, no salvation outside the church. Protestant missions, though, with the exception of like the Dutch Coronia missions,
Yeah.
they weren't initially as focused on directly planting churches. This Catholic emphasis was officially confirmed way back in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. Later, Catholic theology developed the concept of implicit faith, allowing for the possibility of salvation for those who, through no fault of their own, weren't officially part of the visible church. In the 20th century, you see various schools of thought within Catholic missiology, but the general agreement is that founding new communities of faith is crucial to mission.
So if the Catholic Church historically was all about church planting, why were Protestants initially kind of hesitant about it, especially given all that focus on community we just talked about?
Well, like we touched on earlier, those early Protestant missions, especially the ones coming out of Puritanism, Pietism, and the revivals, their main concern was revitalizing existing churches through individual conversion, less about setting up brand new churches in new areas.
Right.
The early Puritans in North America, they definitely envisioned building a godly society with churches at the center.
Yeah.
But their initial attempts at converting Native Americans and setting up lasting churches, those weren't super successful.
Gotcha.
And Pietism, with all its emphasis on personal piety and experience, it didn't really have a well-developed ecclesiology, like a clear theology of the church.
Okay.
Converts naturally came together, sure, but the main motivation was saving individuals, not strategically planting self-supporting churches.
Right.
It was really when those more formally organized, church-based, confessional mission agencies started popping up that explicitly planting churches started to get more attention in Protestant mission thinking.
So it's not that they were against churches, it's just that their focus was elsewhere in the beginning.
Right.
And then developing specific mission agencies later really pushed that church planting idea.
Exactly. It was a shift in focus.
But there were some early Protestants who did get the importance of planting churches, right?
Oh, absolutely. William Carey, he's a key figure here back in 1792 in his book, An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens.
Quite a title.
He specifically said that founding of churches and organizing schools were central to mission work. And importantly, he also advocated for giving those new churches over to the leadership of national pastors as soon as possible. His vision was for the missionary to move on to new, unreached areas. Later in the 19th century, you have really influential guys like Rufus Anderson from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions and Henry Venn from the Church Missionary Society.
Yeah.
They both independently came up with what we now know as the three self-definition for indigenous churches: self-propagating, self-governing, self-supporting.
Right.
Their reasoning was that by establishing churches with these three characteristics, missionaries would be free to go to new places, and the local believers would take responsibility for spreading and nurturing the faith in their own communities.
Makes sense.
Anderson himself said that missions are initiated for the spread of a scriptural, self-propagating Christianity, and he outlined these four key parts: converting individuals, organizing those converts into churches, developing indigenous leadership, and finally, those churches becoming independent.
That's the three self idea, right?
Exactly. And while this three-self formula became pretty much the accepted goal in theory, actually putting it into practice consistently, that proved to be a challenge.
Yeah, that tension between wanting to build up churches, but also being willing to let go of control to trust local leaders, that seems like a recurring theme.
It is. It's a really important tension to be aware of. Then, like we talked about earlier, you have Gustav Warneck coming in again, right in the first sentence of his book, Evangelische Missionslehre, which means Evangelical Missionary Theory, published in 1892. He flat out says that the goal of missions is to plant and organize Christian churches among non-Christian people.
Okay.
For Warneck, mission wasn't just about random individual conversions or one-off preaching events. It needed a planned, organized effort that would eventually result in a self-sustaining national Christian community, essentially, Christianizing a people through the planting and growth of local churches.
Right, so it's not just about getting people saved, it's about building a whole Christian community.
That's it. And a bunch of other influential leaders and theologians in the late 19th and 20th centuries, they echoed this idea as this growing emphasis on church planting as essential to the mission.
So by the middle of the 20th century, would you say that church planting was pretty much seen as a main goal for most missions?
Not quite. Like we discussed before with guys like Johannes Christian Hoekendijk in the 60s and 70s, there was a pretty big, even radical pushback against what he called ecclesiocentric mission. That's mission focused on the church as the main goal. This was within the ecumenical movement.
Right.
But over time, more moderate views popped up within that conciliar movement, and documents from the World Council of Churches started acknowledging that growing local congregations was important to the broader mission.
Okay.
What's interesting is that around the same time, you have the church growth movement led by people like Donald McGavran. They brought in this really influential and kind of contrasting idea of mission as something that leads to churches growing and new believers becoming solid church members.
Right.
For McGavran, church growth was like a visible sign of effective discipleship. And he strongly believed that planting and growing churches was essential for society to improve. He even called the local church the most powerful instrument known for the alleviation of social ills.
Wow.
Other big names in the church growth movement, like C. Peter Wagner and Ralph Winter, they also really emphasized church planting as the best way to evangelize and the link between other ministries and building a lasting Christian presence. And even the Wheaton Declaration of 1966, a major statement from evangelicals, specifically prioritized planting new churches as a core part of mission work.
So it's really fascinating how different groups and thinkers have put different levels of emphasis on church planting throughout history. What about the Lausanne movement? Where did they fit in with all this?
So in the beginning, while the Lausanne Covenant in 74 acknowledged that evangelism should lead to people joining the church, the idea of strategically planting churches wasn't as front and center in the initial statements. But later Lausanne meetings and documents like the Manila Manifesto in '89, they did briefly talk about church planting as this natural chain reaction following evangelism, where new churches become hubs for further outreach.
Right, makes sense.
More recently, there's been a renewed emphasis on church planting within a lot of evangelical movements, especially the ones focused on reaching those unreached people groups and frontier missions. The goal is often to set up an indigenous, self-sustaining church within each distinct language and culture group.
Like a church for every people group.
Exactly. Think about Ralph Winter's focus on the unreached peoples idea and the overall aims of the 82,000 and beyond movement and all those consultations that came after. Terms like discipling a whole nation and strategies like saturation church planting are all part of this renewed focus. And even theologians of today, like John Piper, they've made a strong, biblically based case for prioritizing missions among unreached groups to plant churches that exalt Christ and are full of worship in places where the gospel just hasn't reached yet because of language or culture barriers. He even defined a missionary's passion as zeal to see the name of Jesus Christ glorified among those who have never heard it by bringing them from spiritual death to eternal life through faith in him, resulting in the glad submission of their whole lives to his lordship, especially in the fellowship of his church.
That's a pretty powerful statement.
It is, and it highlights that close connection between evangelism and church planting.
Yeah.
And there's even been recent discussion among evangelicals about whether church planting is the main way that God's mission gets done in the world. So it's a big topic.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
It is.
So from a biblical perspective, it sounds like planting and growing churches isn't just a practical tactic to reach more people. It's actually pretty central to God's plan.
Absolutely. Planting and growing churches aren't just strategies. They're rooted in the whole story of salvation history and in what Christ himself wanted. All through the Bible, we see God working through a chosen people, Israel, in the Old Testament, and the church as his new covenant community in the New.
Right.
Jesus himself said in Matthew 16:88, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." His goal wasn't just to save people as individuals, but to create a people for himself, a collective witness to his work of redemption.
That's a good point.
The New Testament, it emphasizes faith being lived out within a Christian community. In Acts, we see God adding to their number daily those who are being saved, individuals being brought into the early church. The pattern's clear. Evangelism leads to local churches, which are then taken care of by apostles and elders who teach and lead.
Yeah, it all flows together.
It does. Belonging to science, it automatically means belonging to his people, his body, the church. As Newbigin put it, conversion is a summoning of men and women into a visible fellowship with a view to carrying out God's will in the world. The local church, ideally as a Christ-centered, Bible-believing, Spirit-filled community, that's God's primary tool for continuing and expanding his kingdom right now in this age.
And just the fact that Jesus commanded baptism, that implies the formation of communities, right?
Exactly. You can't really baptize someone in isolation.
Right.
While the Great Commission doesn't explicitly say, go plant churches, the command to baptize them points to the forming of groups of believers because baptism is the sign of becoming part of Christ's body.
Right, right. It's that outward sign.
And Paul, in his missions, he definitely prioritized not just evangelism, but planting and helping those churches grow in a healthy way. Recent studies of the New Testament really back this up. He saw his work in a region as mostly finished when he had established reproducing churches and entrusted them to local believers.
Okay.
His letters are full of instructions, encouragement, even correction for these young churches, showing how much he cared about them growing and doing well. Like Kustenberger and O'Brien summarize it by saying that Paul's activities included not just evangelism, but founding churches and bringing believers to maturity in Christ.
So church planting is more than just a practical strategy. It's tied to God's redemptive work and the nature of the church itself, like Christ's bride, as Ephesians 5 talks about.
Exactly.
But our source also points out some important cautions about how we think about and do church planting, doesn't it?
Yes, definitely. While planting churches is important, there are some big concerns to think about regarding what kind of church planting we're doing and the motivations behind it. One big concern is that it shouldn't be seen as just a way to push a certain denomination, institution, or organization's agenda.
Right.
There's a real danger of what some call denominational flag raising, or even worse, sheep stealing from existing congregations.
Yeah.
Neither of those things lines up with how the Bible talks about the unity of Christ's body and the real purpose of mission. Like we talked about before, while Huckendijk's critique of ecclesiocentric mission might have been a bit extreme, he had a good point when he said the church ultimately exists to serve God's purposes in the world and not its own interests.
Right. It's about the bigger picture.
Exactly. Any church planting that's mainly driven by self-promotion or wanting to make an institution bigger, that misses the point of the gospel entirely.
It's important to remember that in the New Testament, new churches were always a result of evangelism and intentional discipleship, not something that came before or separate from those things.
Exactly. In the New Testament model, churches always popped up because people heard and believed the gospel and were formed into communities of faith.
Right.
And these new churches were also seen as interconnected with other churches, forming a bigger network of fellowship and support. And Paul, he was always deeply concerned that these churches would grow in their understanding of Christ, become more holy, and be full of love for each other, and the world not just exist as isolated groups.
Right. So healthy growth is key.
Absolutely. Any church planting that doesn't prioritize true conversion and discipling believers into communities that truly honor Christ in everything they do, that's questionable.
So church planting and growth are vital, but they have to be rooted in real conversion, focused on Christ as Lord, and result in those lively, healthy communities that show what God's kingdom is all about.
Exactly. It's about faithfully planting and nurturing Christ's bride, the church, for his glory, not about building our own little empires or just trying to expand our own organization's reach.
Okay, that's given us a really solid understanding of how people have viewed mission through the lens of proclamation, conversion, and church planting.
Yeah.
When we come back, we'll dig into another historically significant, though often pretty controversial, understanding: civilization and moral improvement as a core objective of missionary work. Stick with us.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been exploring those different historical understandings of the main tasks of Christian mission, and now we're focusing on a historically important but often really problematic perspective, the idea of civilization and moral improvement as like a basic goal of missionary work.
Right. So historically, the idea that missionaries should bring not just the gospel, but also what they saw as the better culture of their sending church, usually Western European or American, to those who weren't Christian, that was a huge part of missionary work for a long time.
Yeah.
Civilization in this context often meant intentionally introducing Western customs, social structures, education systems, and moral codes, all along with the Christian faith.
Okay.
There was often this strong sense of moral duty to civilize anyone seen as heathen savages, primitive, or living in a state of moral and social depravity, at least according to a Western perspective,
Right.
It's pretty wild to think about it now, but for about 1,000 years after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, becoming Christian was often pretty much the same as adopting Roman culture and language. There was very little room for local cultural expressions within the Western Church. Western languages became the norm, and sometimes even the only acceptable languages for worship in the Western Christian world.
It's kind of jarring to think about that level of cultural imposition from where we stand today.
It really is, and for a lot of early missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, it was common practice to gather new converts into separate Christian communities. Sometimes they even formed whole new towns or settlements that were modeled after Western social and cultural norms. And within these communities, they'd often teach Western customs, dress, how to run a household, social etiquette, and what they considered Christian lifestyles and morals.
So they were basically recreating their own society in these new places.
Yeah, pretty much. And while there were definitely some missionaries who were more sensitive to local cultures and tried to learn and respect their traditions, the overall assumption was often that Western culture just was Christian culture, or at least the most advanced, morally superior kind of culture. So they thought adopting it was necessary for becoming truly Christian. From our point of view in the 21st century, with a better understanding of cultural differences and how complex cross-cultural communication is, we tend to, and often rightly, condemn this mixing of Western culture and the gospel, especially because of the history of colonialism, ethnocentrism, and all the harm that caused.
Right.
But it's also super important to try to understand where they were coming from historically. For those earlier generations, separating their deep religious beliefs from their own cultural expressions and norms, that was a really tough thing to do, both intellectually and practically.
Yeah, I can see that.
And often they felt this genuine, although maybe misguided, moral obligation to civilize indigenous people. Sometimes it was even seen as a prerequisite for communicating the gospel effectively, or just as a basic act of compassion toward those they saw as living in darkness.
Right, like it was their duty to enlighten them.
Exactly. Failing to civilize might have seemed like a missed opportunity, or even like they were neglecting their moral duty, or that they were implicitly saying these uncivilized people weren't fully human.
So it's like they were operating within a totally different worldview, where their ideas about culture were inseparable from their religious beliefs.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Who were some of the big thinkers or movements that really connected missions with this idea of civilizing?
Well, even Desiderius Erasmus, that super influential Renaissance humanist back in the 16th century, a key figure in the Reformation era, he talked about missionary work as the taming of wild peoples and introducing them to a more refined, learned way of life, which he